The paradox of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is a man of marble and myth, at once the sage of liberty and the silent master of hundreds in bondage. He wrote the most quoted phrase in American history, "All men are created equal," yet spent his life treating that ideal as conditional. Jefferson's contradiction is not just a personal failing, it is a mirror reflecting the deep fractures within America's founding principles. He believed in the natural rights of man, yet owned slaves until the day he died. He promoted the separation of church and state, but occasionally used religious rhetoric to justify colonial expansion. He envisioned a government of the people, yet excluded women, African Americans, Native peoples, and the poor from that vision. He feared tyranny, yet expanded presidential powers more aggressively than many of his predecessors. Few figures in American history have inspired such enduring fascination, or such divisive debate. To some, Jefferson is a philosopher king, the etched embodiment of Enlightenment thought transplanted onto American soil. To others, he is the architect of a democracy whose moral foundations were compromised from its inception. Understanding Jefferson is essential not only to understanding the American Revolution, but to understanding the contradictions that continue to shape the United States today. His life invites us into the very heart of the American paradox, a republic founded on freedom, constructed atop slavery. Thomas Jefferson was born into privilege on April 13, 1743, in Shadwell, a plantation in the British colony of Virginia. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a surveyor, planter, and member of Virginia's elite gentry, an ambitious man who mapped the Virginia-North Carolina border and helped define the land on which his son would later wield power. By age 14, Thomas had inherited approximately 5,000 acres and dozens of enslaved workers. The Jefferson family was not just wealthy, they were participants in a colonial economy that revolved around tobacco and slavery, both of which shaped Thomas's understanding of power, race, and ownership from a young age. He was the third of 10 children in a world governed by hierarchy. Race, class, gender, and land ownership determined one's place in society. In this environment, Jefferson absorbed both the intellectual elegance of Enlightenment ideals and the brutal normalization of human bondage. Jefferson's intellectual formation began under the tutelage of Reverend James Morey, a classical scholar and Anglican clergyman, and matured at the College of William and Mary. There, he encountered the Scottish Enlightenment through Dr. William Small, who introduced him to the works of John Locke, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and Montesquieu. From these thinkers, Jefferson drew the foundation of his personal philosophy. Locke's social contract inspired Jefferson's vision of natural rights. Bacon's empiricism fed his fascination with science and observation. Montesquieu's separation of powers became central to Jeffersonian republicanism. Jefferson was obsessive in his studies, known to read up to 15 hours a day, fluent in Greek, Latin, French, and Italian, and later collecting over 6,000 books in what became the Library of Congress after the British burned Washington in 1814. He once wrote, "I cannot live without books." His curriculum was vast, from geometry and astronomy to ethics and political philosophy, reflecting his view that statesmanship required a polymath's mind. He saw the rational, self-improving individual as the bedrock of society, and yet failed to apply that logic to the enslaved people living under his roof. In 1767, Jefferson was admitted to the Virginia bar. He was not a courtroom showman, but a brilliant legal writer and drafter. His most enduring impact in this period came from his legislative efforts, not litigation. By his mid-20s, he had already begun designing Monticello, his mountaintop estate. Modeled on Palladian architecture, the design reflected his admiration for symmetry, reason, and order. But Monticello also became a site of contradiction, built by enslaved hands, maintained by unpaid labor, and funded through tobacco, a crop notorious for its dependence on the brutal plantation system. In 1769, Jefferson was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he quickly aligned himself with more radical colonial voices calling for resistance to British rule. Yet, he did not yet see independence as inevitable. His tone was legalistic, not revolutionary, asserting colonial rights under British law rather than rejecting the monarchy outright. That changed with the passage of punitive measures like the Coercive Acts, 1774, Britain's crackdown on Boston, after the Tea Party. Jefferson responded with his first truly radical work, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. Written in just a few days, this pamphlet electrified the revolutionary movement. Jefferson argued that the colonies were not subjects of Parliament, but of the king alone, and even that allegiance was conditional on justice. He wrote, God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. This document catapulted Jefferson into the revolutionary vanguard. It circulated widely in Britain and America, drawing admiration for its elegant prose and bold assertions. It was clear, a new political thinker had emerged, young, eloquent, and uncompromising. And yet, even here, contradictions abounded. Jefferson spoke passionately of liberty while enslaving approximately 175 people at the time of the pamphlet's publication. Among them was Sally Hemings, who was only 1 year old at the time, whom Jefferson would later begin a decades-long relationship with, starting when she was around 14 and he was in his 40s. By 1775, the colonies stood on the brink of war. Jefferson had become one of Virginia's most eloquent revolutionaries, but behind the high-minded rhetoric lay a man deeply entrenched in the very system he condemned in theory. He viewed slavery as a necessary evil, writing that it was like holding a wolf by the ear, dangerous to keep but even more dangerous to let go. Yet rather than manumit, free, his slaves or advocate for immediate abolition, Jefferson doubled down on rationalizations and logistical delays. In his own lifetime, he freed only 5 people, all members of the Hemings family, and only in his will. The revolutionary world Jefferson would soon help shape was already a world of moral compromise, and he was perhaps its most articulate contradiction. By mid-1776, the colonies had reached a breaking point with Britain. The battles of Lexington and Concord had already erupted. The Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, tasked with what was arguably the most revolutionary act in modern history, severing all political ties with the British Empire. At just 33 years old, Thomas Jefferson was appointed to a 5-man committee alongside John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston to draft a formal declaration. Adams and Franklin, both older and more experienced, deferred to Jefferson for one reason: his exceptional writing. "You can write 10 times better than I can," Adams reportedly told him. Jefferson retreated to a rented room at Graff House, and over the course of 17 days, penned the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. He drew heavily from Enlightenment philosophy, particularly John Locke's theory of natural rights and the right of revolution. But what Jefferson created was more than a political statement. It was a moral manifesto for a new world order. On July 4, 1776, after extensive edits by Franklin, Adams, and the Continental Congress, the Declaration was adopted. Its preamble remains among the most iconic passages in political history. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These lines would be cited for centuries by abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights leaders, and freedom fighters around the world. Yet their power is haunted by what was left out. What textbooks often leave out is that Jefferson's original draft included a passionate condemnation of slavery. In a scathing paragraph, he accused King George III of violating human rights by allowing the slave trade to flourish in the colonies. He wrote, "The king has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery." Jefferson, a slaveholder himself, denounced the transatlantic slave trade in fierce moral terms. But Southern delegates, particularly from South Carolina and Georgia, demanded the clause be removed. They feared alienating British West Indian allies and destabilizing their economies. Northern merchants also profited from the slave trade and were unwilling to jeopardize business interests. Jefferson later expressed frustration about the removal, but he did not fight for its reinstatement. In the end, economic self-interest, both, North and South, overrode moral conviction. The clause was cut, and with it, the most direct challenge to slavery from the document that claimed liberty as its birthright. The Declaration traveled the globe, translated into over 200 languages, cited by revolutionaries in France, abolitionists in Haiti, and reformers in Latin America. Yet in the country of its origin, the promise of equality remained incomplete. Jefferson had lit a torch of liberty, but he would spend the rest of his life evading its fire. Despite his anti-slavery rhetoric, Thomas Jefferson enslaved over 600 people in his lifetime, making him one of the largest slaveholders among the Founding Fathers. At Monticello, his picturesque estate in the Virginia hills, Jefferson cultivated not only ideas but wealth. The land was worked primarily by enslaved men, women, and children, many of whom were bought, sold, or inherited from his father-in-law, John Wales. Jefferson categorized his slaves by skill: blacksmiths, carpenters, nail-makers, cooks, and field hands. He even devised a system of rewards and punishments, keeping meticulous records of their labor and behavior. He referred to slavery as a necessary evil, something he wished would end, but which he justified as economically essential and too socially complex to dismantle quickly. "We have the wolf by the ears," he famously wrote. "We can neither hold him nor safely let him go." But Jefferson wasn't merely holding on. He profited from enslaved labor and used enslaved people as collateral for loans. When his plantation faced financial strain, he sold 130 enslaved people in 1827, following his death, to pay off debt, more than all the books and furniture combined. Perhaps the most damning and personal contradiction of Jefferson's life was his relationship with Sally Hemings, his late wife's half-sister, and one of the enslaved people he legally owned. DNA testing in 1998, confirmed by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, established that Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with Hemings. Their relationship began in Paris in the 1780s, when Jefferson was in his mid-40s, and Hemings was approximately 14 to 16 years old. Hemings remained enslaved, but was given privileges, such as lighter work and eventual informal freedom for her children, none of whom were officially freed by Jefferson in his lifetime, except in his will. This relationship, hidden for centuries and denied by historians, exposes the profound imbalance of power in Jefferson's private life. Hemings, by law, could not consent. The relationship has been reframed by modern scholars not as a romance, but as a power imbalance rooted in ownership and patriarchy. In his only full-length book, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson elaborated on his views about race, and they are deeply unsettling. He wrote, "Comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to the whites, in reason much inferior." He went on to suggest that black people were less capable of abstract thought and less aesthetically pleasing. These views were not only racist, they were used for centuries to justify slavery, segregation, and scientific racism. Ironically, this book was written in the very years when Jefferson was shaping American ideals abroad and criticizing European monarchies for their tyranny. Jefferson's writings reveal an internal war. He knew slavery was wrong, but he lacked the political courage, or the will, to challenge it meaningfully. He proposed gradual emancipation, coupled with colonization, suggesting that freed slaves be sent to Africa, a proposal that would later influence the American Colonization Society in the 19th century. He freed only 5 enslaved individuals during his lifetime, all members of the Hemings family, and continued to support slaveholding allies in politics. Jefferson, who could imagine a nation out of revolution, could not imagine a country where black and white people lived equally. Jefferson's first major political role after the Revolution began was as governor of Virginia during the turbulent final years of the war. His term, 1779 to 1781, was marked by political instability, a collapsing economy, and military chaos. Despite his intellect and ideals, Jefferson proved a poor wartime executive. His decentralized philosophy led to delays in mobilizing state militias, and British troops under Benedict Arnold and Lord Cornwallis raided deep into Virginia, forcing Jefferson to flee the capital. Critics accused him of cowardice and dereliction of duty. Although he was later cleared of misconduct, the episode wounded Jefferson's reputation and exposed the flaws of his belief in weak executive power, a belief he would later contradict during his presidency. After the war, Jefferson succeeded Benjamin Franklin as minister to France. He arrived in Paris in 1785 and became deeply immersed in Enlightenment salons, conversing with figures like Lafayette, Condorcet, and Madame de Staël. He admired the French philosophes and reformist spirit. He witnessed the early stirrings of the French Revolution and supported constitutional reform. He lived a lavish lifestyle in Paris, attended court at Versailles, and began a relationship with Sally Hemings, who had accompanied his daughter as part of his household staff. In letters, Jefferson praised the idea of liberty, but remained cautious about the pace of radical change. When the revolution turned violent after 1789, he defended it in private correspondence, stating, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." This romanticized view of revolutionary violence sharply contrasts with the conservative fears Jefferson would later express during rebellions on American soil, most notably the Haitian Revolution and Gabriel's Rebellion. Under George Washington, Jefferson served as the first Secretary of State. Here, his deep political schism with Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, took center stage. The two men clashed repeatedly. Jefferson feared Hamilton's policies would lead to a monarch-like president and warned of elite domination. Their feud birthed the first political party system, Jefferson's Democratic Republicans versus Hamilton's Federalists. Ironically, Jefferson's creation of a political party, an act he initially condemned, was a strategic contradiction born of necessity. He believed parties were divisive and dangerous but created one to fight Hamilton's growing power. The election of 1800 was one of the most contentious in U.S. history. Jefferson defeated John Adams after a bitter, party-driven campaign that nearly ended in a constitutional crisis due to an electoral tie with Aaron Burr. This moment led Jefferson to famously declare, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." But in reality, Jefferson used his presidency to undo many Federalist policies, allowed the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire, repealed internal taxes, slashed the federal budget and military. He called this a revolution, but it was a revolution within limits, designed to reshape federal power, not abolish it. Jefferson's presidency, 1801-1809, was a masterclass in contradiction. Jefferson doubled the size of the United States by purchasing Louisiana from Napoleon for $15 million. This move directly violated his strict constitutional principles, which did not explicitly authorize such an acquisition. He admitted the inconsistency. The acquisition of New Orleans would make me abandon my theory for a moment. Jefferson justified the purchase as necessary for agrarian expansion, but it also laid the groundwork for the expansion of slavery into new territories, intensifying sectional tensions. Jefferson idealized Native Americans in theory, but pursued aggressive policies in practice, promoted assimilation through agriculture, Christianity, and English education, advocated land cessions through treaties, with the threat of military force if necessary. He told Lewis and Clark to inform tribes that a new great father ruled the continent. This laid the ideological groundwork for Indian removal decades later. In an attempt to pressure Britain and France during the Napoleonic Wars, Jefferson banned all American exports. It backfired catastrophically. Exports fell by 80%, harming American farmers and merchants. Critics accused Jefferson of government overreach, and many who had once supported him turned against his use of federal power. Jefferson retired to Monticello in 1809, but remained deeply engaged in public life. Founded the University of Virginia in 1819, calling it the last act of usefulness he could perform, corresponded with John Adams, reconciling their long-standing rivalry in a legendary series of letters. But even in retirement, Jefferson's contradictions persisted. He died deeply in debt, unable to escape the economic realities of the slave-based plantation system he had helped normalize. He died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, just hours before John Adams. For generations, Jefferson was enshrined as the sage of democracy, a symbol of the Enlightenment's triumph in the New World. His name appears on schools, streets, and currency. The Jefferson Memorial, built in 1943, calls him the Apostle of Freedom. Yet beginning in the late 20th century, and especially in the 21st, historians began to reassess Jefferson's legacy with sharper focus. Modern scholarship has recentered his racism and support for white supremacy, the Hemings relationship as an abuse of power, his failure to meaningfully act on slavery. Jefferson was once used by white supremacists to justify racial hierarchy. Today, he's being reinterpreted by both progressives and conservatives alike, some defending his complexity, others calling for his removal from public monuments. Jefferson's story is the story of the United States, a nation founded on freedom, but dependent on unfreedom, a republic that celebrated equality while excluding most of its people, a people who praised liberty while denying it to others. He foresaw this tension himself, writing in notes on the state of Virginia. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Thomas Jefferson was neither hero nor villain, but something more unsettling. A man who believed in liberty while denying it to others, who wrote beautiful truths while living painful lies. To study him is not to cancel him, but to confront the reality that the American story is born not just of ideals, but of hypocrisies. His words continue to inspire, but his life continues to challenge us. During the mid-20th century, Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal," took on renewed life in the hands of civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In his 1963 "I Have a Dream" speech, King directly referenced Jefferson's language, "I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream, that all men are created equal." Here was the irony. Black Americans were using Jefferson's own words to hold America accountable, to force it to fulfill promises he had written, but never lived by. Jefferson became both a symbol of hope and a symbol of betrayal. Civil rights activists quoted him not because he was a model of racial justice, but because his ideals were more just than his actions. The late 20th century brought a wave of revisionist scholarship. Historians like Annette Gordon Reed, Henry Winchek, and Joseph Ellis began confronting the full scope of Jefferson's contradictions. Key revelations included Jefferson's financial entanglement with slavery, including borrowing against enslaved people as property. The DNA confirmation of his paternity of Sally Hemings' children, 1998. Detailed records of plantation operations at Monticello, showing a deeply embedded dependence on slave labor. Monticello, itself, once a monument to Jefferson's Enlightenment brilliance, was transformed. Tours began including the slave quarters, oral histories of Hemings' descendants, and exhibitions that center the voices of the enslaved. Jefferson, once portrayed as above the fray, was now placed squarely inside America's racial and moral dilemmas. The 21st century brought with it a cultural reckoning. As the U.S. grappled with systemic racism, public statues and memorials of slaveholders became battlegrounds. In Charlottesville, Virginia, Jefferson's hometown, white nationalists marched in 2017 chanting "You will not replace us," protesting the removal of a Confederate monument. The rally resulted in violence and a death, prompting national debates about monuments. Jefferson, long regarded as untouchable, was no longer exempt. New York City Council removed his statue from City Hall in 2021, citing his slaveholding past. University students petitioned for the renaming of Jefferson buildings. Conservatives warned against erasing history, while others argued that recontextualizing history was not erasure, but evolution. A new question emerged. How should a democracy remember a man who defined liberty while denying it to so many? Jefferson's story became central to the so-called History wars in American schools. Some states passed laws restricting the teaching of America's racial history. Others emphasized inclusive curricula that foregrounded Jefferson's contradictions. Jefferson's name remained in textbooks, but the tone changed. No longer pure admiration, but critical examination. This shift is part of a broader cultural change, hero worship giving way to historical accountability. Despite his contradictions, Jefferson still embodies a timeless truth, that ideas can be more powerful than the people who conceive them. His vision of a government by the people, a Bill of Rights, religious freedom, public education, and individual liberty shaped the American political DNA. These values endure. Global democratic movements still cite Jefferson. Human rights declarations echo his structure. His concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness remains a moral compass. Jefferson the writer left behind a world-changing legacy, even if Jefferson the man failed to live by it. Jefferson's brilliance lies in his capacity to articulate the highest aspirations of human society, even as his personal behavior betrayed those ideals. In that contradiction lies his symbolic power. He is not great because he was flawless. He is great because he gave language to a struggle we are still in. Modern thinkers argue that confronting Jefferson honestly is not an act of disrespect, but of moral clarity. To admire the idea of Jefferson without scrutinizing the reality is to perpetuate the very myths he helped create. The nation continues to live out Jefferson's paradox. Liberty versus oppression. Idealism versus reality. Equality versus hierarchy. The same tensions that haunted Jefferson's life, between word and deed, philosophy and power, remain unresolved in American politics, culture, and race relations. He is a mirror, a reminder, a warning. Thomas Jefferson cannot be confined to either pedestal or pillory. He exists somewhere in between, a man of soaring genius and tragic contradiction. To tell the untold story of Jefferson is not to dismantle his legacy, but to complete it, to illuminate the shadows, wrestle with the truths, and understand the America he helped build in all its brilliance and all its brokenness. Thomas Jefferson, more than any other founding father, continues to define the American national psyche, not just in history books, but in cultural debates, political ideologies, and even moral reckonings. His name, writings, and legacy resurface whenever the nation confronts questions of who it is and who it wants to become. As America becomes increasingly diverse, complex, and divided, Jefferson's legacy looms large, not as a static monument, but as a living contradiction. His words inspired revolutions, yet his actions reflected deep injustices. For many, this paradox mirrors the United States itself, a country founded on liberty, yet built on slavery, a nation that proclaims equality, but struggles to deliver it. In today's polarized America, Jefferson is claimed by all sides, yet fully understood by none. Conservatives often invoke his belief in limited government, states' rights, and the sanctity of the individual. Liberals lean on his defense of secularism, civil liberties, and educational reform. Meanwhile, anti-racist scholars and social justice activists view Jefferson through a sharper lens, calling out his ownership of over 600 enslaved people, his racist writings, and his lifelong evasion of the very ideals he penned in the Declaration of Independence. This tension reflects a broader national crisis: how to reconcile the mythic founding narrative with the historical realities of exploitation, exclusion, and oppression. This tension has bled into classrooms, public discourse, and political battlegrounds. As educators attempt to present a more inclusive and honest view of American history, Jefferson's role becomes increasingly contested. In some states, there is backlash against teaching his connection to slavery or his relationship with Sally Hemings. In others, Jefferson is held up as a case study in complexity, a man of Enlightenment ideals and moral failings. These competing views aren't just academic. They shape how young Americans see their country, their government, and themselves. Outside the United States, Jefferson's legacy also sparks conflicting views. In democratic societies, his writings still serve as a model of resistance against tyranny. In post-colonial regions, however, Jefferson is sometimes viewed as a hypocritical figure, an Enlightenment philosopher who defended the racial hierarchies that justified colonialism. The global Jefferson, much like the American one, is fragmented, both visionary and deeply flawed. He is, in essence, a vessel through which each society reflects its own aspirations and anxieties. Ultimately, Jefferson's legacy forces America to confront its identity crisis. He is not merely a historical figure, he is the embodiment of a national paradox. As the country continues to grapple with racial injustice, economic inequality, political instability, and cultural division, Jefferson serves as both an origin point and a cautionary tale. To wrestle with Jefferson is to wrestle with America itself, not only with what it has been, but with what it dares to be. Thomas Jefferson cannot be reduced to either saint or villain. His life defies binary judgment. He was a genius who advanced human liberty and a man who denied that liberty to hundreds of people he enslaved. He spoke of equality, yet held a racial worldview rooted in hierarchy and supremacy. He envisioned a nation governed by reason, but built his personal fortune on the exploitation of human beings. To understand Jefferson honestly is to embrace the complexity he represents, not to excuse his failings, but to confront them with courage and clarity. In many ways, Jefferson's greatest contribution to the world was not his example, but his words, especially those in the Declaration of Independence. "All men are created equal" has transcended its author. These words have been repurposed and reinterpreted by generations of activists and reformers, abolitionists, suffragists, labor organizers, civil rights leaders, LGBTQ advocates, and more. What Jefferson wrote in 1776 has become a kind of moral covenant, one that the nation still struggles to fulfill. The irony is profound. The man who denied liberty to so many also gave future generations the language to demand it. Today, Jefferson's legacy challenges us not to admire him blindly, but to learn from him critically. His vision of progress, education, and liberty remains valuable, but it must be balanced by a recognition of his human failings. His story warns against the dangers of unchecked privilege and idealism detached from action. It also reminds us that democracy is not the work of perfect men, but of flawed humans reaching for a better world. The project of America, its laws, its freedoms, its justice system, cannot rest on unexamined myths. It must be built on truths, however uncomfortable. Jefferson's life illustrates a deep truth about democratic societies, that ideals often outlive their authors and sometimes even correct them. His words have become a foundation, not because he lived them, but because others chose to. If there is redemption in Jefferson's legacy, it does not lie in ignoring his hypocrisy, but in surpassing it. It lies in using his ideas as tools for justice, not as shields for inequity. As long as the United States continues to strive toward a more perfect union, Jefferson will remain a part of the conversation, not as an untouchable hero, but as a deeply human figure whose contradictions reflect the nation's own. In the end, Jefferson holds up a mirror to America, reflecting its brilliance and its blindness, its promise and its peril. His life demands that we ask the hardest questions about race, freedom, memory, and justice. He does not offer answers, but perhaps that's the point. The task of living up to Jefferson's words and confronting his legacy with honesty is not his to complete. It is ours.